I'm the vice president of STC New England, so I'm responsible for programs. And this program came about because there's so much overlap between technical communication and the world of usability, because we have a shared concern, which is how do we enable people to use technology successfully? And because we have this overlap, I had spoken to BostonCHI for a while about, well, we should do a topic, but what should it be? So I went to a steering committee meeting, and we came up with a 3-part topic, because I was told that UX people sometimes get dragooned into writing user documentation. And I hear some smiles, so that sounds like that must happen. And technical writers are always doing usability, but we do it on the fly. Often the feedback we give, which is very unofficial, doesn't have much weight. And we are very interested in there it is. What happened there? Okay. We're very interested in doing usability testing of what we write, but we often are not given the opportunity to do that. So Ava Kaniasty tonight is going to give the tech writers some hints on how to do usability testing of user documentation. And Chris LaRoche, who has worked in both worlds, is going to give us his expertise and wisdom about working in both fields and the prospects for both fields. So a little knowledge about me. I've been a tech writer for 30 years. I did freelancing for 20 of the 30 years, so I've worked in a lot of places. And 5 years ago, I finally landed at Doble Engineering in Watertown. We make test equipment for the power grid. So we have test equipment that measures the electrical activity of circuit breakers and generators and transformers. And we run tests on them. We get graphics of the electrical activity. You analyze the activity, and that tells you the condition of the equipment. So, for the UX people here, someday you too may be a technical writer. And it may be unwillingly, and it may be only temporary, but if you get told that you have to do this, I'd like to give you some tips about how to do it successfully. So in the scenario I'm going to propose, the lottery plays a big part. The technical writer at your company wins the lottery and for some reason immediately resigns and retires. And you, let us say, are the usability expert for the software. So you already know the software inside out. You're literate, you know how to write your name, you know how to read and write. The project manager says, how hard can it be? You will fill in and do the documentation until we get a new writer, if we ever do. So I want to talk you through this is sort of the conceptual survival guide with a few practical tips. Because the really nitty-gritty details, you will just struggle and suffer to master the way everyone else does, with forums and email lists and desperate phone calls. And I just want to arm you with the mental fortitude to go through this. So there are 4 stages of a documentation project. Wrestling with the alligator. That is scoping the project, because I'm sure, as you know from your work, it is very easy for someone to make a little request of you. So they think because it was easy to write down that request, that it will be easy for you to do it. But the scope of the work is like this. So, and that can turn into a bit of a tussle as you try to convince people of what's involved. The fun part, if you're a writer, is writing. The alligator tango is reviewing. And that, again, is engaging closely with the people that you have to interact with. I'm sure you know all about reviews, so again, I'm just going to give you the more focused tips. And rejoicing the day that it's done. Wrestling with the alligator. Here is a request. It's fake, but it's very similar to what we actually have in our online system. Someone put in a request, let's say a sales representative, who knows he wants to make a big sale to a big customer, so he wants a document to be revised, maybe ahead of schedule. So he specifies, I want to revise a user guide, and it's urgent. Could you get it done within the next few days? Here is his request. This is all the detail you get. I've made up a fake chromatography analysis unit. I used to work in biotech, and I didn't want to involve my real employer, so I made this up. The analyzer HPLC4, the user guide, should have sections that reflect the 3 new stages and also software updates. Then he tries to comfort us. He says, this document should be easily created by changing the hardware pictures and model number and insert the application notes in the right places. That's it, you're done. Well, you start wrestling with the alligator when you decide, okay, let's deal with reality. First of all, here's the original panel, the version 3. And notice that this button is called Burst. Version 4, we have 3 new buttons, and the old button is now called Seek or Sequence. So how hard could it be? Well, these buttons represent massive rethinking of the software. These happen to be controls that physicalize it. But there's going to be more involved than putting in new pictures. So the way you maintain your sanity is use a tool called a publication plan, a pub plan or a doc plan. It's your design document. It's your sword and buckler. It's your shield. It states the scope of what you're going to do. It creates accountability for you and the people who are your resources that you must draw on. It can be revised whenever necessary. So if you're working in a really agile organization, it's still a good idea to have this document, but it's a working document. It creates consistent shared understanding of what you've signed on for. So here is a little excerpt. And you fill it in. This is the first dose of reality. For example, what release are we talking about? What's the projected date? What translations will be needed? That adds a large amount of flurry and a lot of time. Subject matter experts. The sales rep who requested this is not the person you need to get information from. Those people are engineers, developers, the product manager, the project manager. How is this going out? Is it going out just as a PDF? Is it going out as print? Is there any chance you're still going to be sending this out? This, which I'm a little hesitant to say I worked on, came out in 1994. I'm not hesitant to say I worked on it, but it did come out in 1994. And you could also be outputting to ebook. It could be going out on a CD-ROM. You could be exporting to any kind of HTML help. Who's your intended audience? Is it the technician who just wants a list of steps? Or is it the PhD who does the analysis? You're going to write with very different levels of detail, depending on who this is for. And the most important statement that you will leave for last in creating this pub plan is the scope, because you have to get all these other ducks in a row before you'll know how to fill that in. So let us refresh our memory. According to our request, we need to change some hardware pictures. We need to replace some part numbers. And we need to stuff some application notes, which are fully self-contained documents, into what was specified as a user guide. Now, a user guide or a user manual is still organized like this. If you're dealing with web apps and websites, you're used to that wonderful three-dimensional matrix of links that can go anywhere. But a user manual still follows a linear format. And all that information that's in the application notes needs to be, you need to identify it. Where does it fit in this flow? Because the users of a user manual are also thinking in this logical fashion. So you can't just take 3 application notes and stuff them into one location, which is maybe what your requester thinks. He thinks you'll change the photographs in the front panel and system topography section, and you'll stuff those app notes in there. But as you do your analysis, you know you've got to revise all the stuff in lavender. The other color coding is for those 3 new buttons. You see that the right side is a lot longer because you have to add new sections. Same thing here, is a lot more work involved. And the whole table of contents goes like that. So these new topics, you then put them in your publication plan. You list them, and you fill up those lines, and you keep going, adding these new topics or revised topics. And you also, since we're talking about pages, you do an estimated page count. It's not possible to estimate ahead of time which new piece of information is going to explode into very demanding detail and which is truly just a line edit in a pre-existing page. But you can take the PDF of a document like this and look at the length of the existing topics, give it your best guess as to the number of pages of changes that you're going to make. So this is, you're wrestling with that alligator, getting, interjecting reality into what you were asked to do in that casual request. And your project manager is asking you to do this. So the next part of the pub plan is develop your schedule. And I'm sure you know about schedules, so I'll just hit the highlights of documentation schedules. You write the publication plan first, circulate it, get agreement. Then you have your basis for work. You get your source information, which can be specifications, it can be access to the wiki that the developers are using, email lists, meetings, anything that can help out. You create your first draft, you circulate it for review, second draft, second review. If it's a big project, third draft, final sign-off draft, final sign-off review. And you're asked to estimate the time. Now, how do you do that? Well, one way is to, if you go online, you say, how long does it take to write a user guide? The estimates go, well, take the number of pages and multiply by 2 hours per page. Or number of pages in our outline, the number of pages that you're going to change. That page count, multiply by 2 or 8, whatever you think is right. An engineer that I worked with, who was one of those very numbery guys that I think would be good at estimating, he said that he always consistently underestimated, and he had learned to do his best possible realistic estimate and then multiply it by 2.5. And that would give him a realistic schedule to lay out for his manager. So you can do that. You can also just build back from the release date and prioritize. They want you to, if you have 36 new topics to put in, but you only have a month to do it in, you have to go to your project manager and say, look, these are the topics I know I'm going to work on. I can't do them all. Prioritize them for me. But one way or another, you need to get that schedule set up. Okay, so you've done that. You've got your subject matter experts lined up. You've got your schedule. You've got your outline. Your pub plan has been signed off. You're ready to get to work. I thought I would just give you the most practical tips I could. And so the thing is, I think that if you get asked to do user documentation, you are perfectly positioned to do it because you have the right question in mind already, which is, what does the user need? When we're writing a user document, there are a lot of ideas about what it should look like. It shouldn't look like anything in particular. It should just answer the questions that the user has. And if that means it comes out as a little laminated card instead of a print book, or if it isn't even made into a PDF that they have to print on their laser printers, it could be HTML topics. But the only words you need to use are the words that answer, this user's trying to do something. What does he need to know at this point? Why is he looking at the document at this moment? What's the problem he's likely to have run into? What information will address that problem? So the guiding question, what is the reader trying to do? Only present the information that helps the reader achieve that goal. And the reason that this too is a bit of a tussle is that a lot of your sources are going to be engineers, and engineers passionately love what they do, and they think that users should know everything about this wonderful product. And I just had a little battle with an engineer last week. I'm trying to nail him down on what are the steps that the user needs to know? What are the problems they're going to encounter? And he keeps pushing me to put theoretical information in. And I say, no. The guys on the substations, they don't want to know the theory. They want to know how to ground this successfully so they don't get electrocuted. And he says, no, they should know about that. The theory. You have to fight that battle. Also, you will always be fighting the battle that a lot of people think a user guide is a sort of prettied up specification. It starts in the upper left corner of the user interface, and it goes down every menu, and then it goes across every button, every drop-down list, on every page of the UI. That's a user guide. No, it's not. A user guide is task-oriented. It's what are the problems your reader is encountering, and what information can you provide that will be helpful. Okay. You're flung into a sea of Word files or FrameMaker files, or you're suddenly inside RoboHelp or Flare, or AuthorIt or Doc2Help, some tool that you've either used but not in this way or not at all. For you to survive, I suggest that you rely heavily on what's already there. Instead of trying to figure out the formatting, cut, paste, and edit it. Especially if you're working in the wonderful world of Word, and someone says, here, you could just cut and paste from what I wrote. Do not do that. Copy it, paste it into Notepad, strip out all the formatting, cut it again, dump it into Word, and tag it with your own styles. I had a friend who worked at a document that they had drunk the Microsoft Kool-Aid that everyone can collaborate in Word files, everyone can contribute. And the numbering was like, Chapter 1, Section 17. Chapter 2, Section 4.3. They could not get the auto-numbering fixed. She could not do it, short of, I think, going into the code, which she did not have time to do. So unless you're superbly confident with the clean cut and paste into Notepad, clean it up, and then put it in your Word, in your document. Ask for a corporate style guide for usage issues, if they don't have one. Pick a standard and stick to it. People can come to blows over whether there's a space between 9 millivolt or 9 millivolt. Google and Wikipedia are your friends for background information that you don't want to ask the engineer about because it's just for your own understanding. All right, reviews. You know all about reviews. You work in high technology. For pain-free documentation reviews, clean this document up as if it were about to be published on the New York Times front page. Otherwise, your reviewers will get distracted. Instead of reviewing the technical content, which is hard, they will fixate on your typos and whether there are 2 spaces between these words instead of 1. Assign sections to specific reviewers. Only give your hardware guy the hardware section. Clearly state what you want, that you want them to review for technical accuracy and completeness. Mark questions for reviewers, but be aware that this is not enough. It doesn't matter what you do. This was not enough. The definition of the word slope defines baseline change in microvolts per second. Bob! Spec says millivolts, which is it? Does Bob see this? No. Engineers have glands in their heads that keep them from seeing their names and the bold, italic, 14-point red type with their name on it. So you have to pursue them. Expect to get review comments from total strangers because Bob will hand out review copies to other engineers. He doesn't tell you about it. Expect to be asked for review copies by total strangers. It's fine if they're other engineers, but what if it's a sales rep? He's heard that this is in the works and he thinks he can hand it to prospective customers. But it hasn't been blessed. It could have information that hasn't been released yet. Your project manager should be your friend, and if he's not, you can still use him. Really lean on him. That person in that role should help you deal with uncooperative reviewers. When you get all of this other stuff done, you get your final approval, the thing is released, you can go on to rejoicing. And I'm just about out of time. I hope that this whirlwind tour of sort of mental armor is helpful to you. if you ever get asked to do this. And this will be up on the, we'll send out a link to the STC New England Google Drive. I'm going to beef up the resources for the various tools. The most important resource is, of course, STC New England. We also have a new site. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I am Eva Kaniasty, and I work as an independent consultant. And one of the things that I do is usability testing. So what I'm going to try to do today is to give you a very quick, really the flavor of what usability testing feels like and how you can do it for documentation. Before I do that, I've actually brought some props, and I'm going to make this a little bit interactive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass around this camera, and I do need it back at the end of the session. So I'd like you to just take a look at it, and if you feel comfortable, try to take a picture of me, someone else in the room, whatever you feel like. So feel free to play around with it, and we'll talk about why I'm doing this in a minute. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just, what is a usability test? How many people here have observed a usability test? How many of you have conducted or moderated? So it sounds like most of you already know what I'll be talking about, but there's really a few key elements that I think need to be there for something to be a usability test. One of those is users, clearly. And the closer your users are to the people who will actually be using the product or software, the better. You'll need a product. And the reason I brought my camera today, I actually have, it's two versions of the same camera, is because even if you're doing documentation testing, what you want to avoid doing is giving people a manual and telling them to give you feedback or to test it. And Nancy actually mentioned this with writing as well. Usability testing really has to be focused on tasks and scenarios that are realistic. It can't be something where somebody's just reading through something and give you feedback. You won't get the same quality. So these are kind of the key elements that you'll need. And I'm going to go through 3 example scenarios that you can take to testing. And which one you choose is really going to depend on what you're trying to test and what type of documentation. And let me just talk about each of them. Unboxing or setup is the first one. Anybody here not know what unboxing is? Okay, so most physical products come in a box. A usability test where you do an unboxing would be to give somebody a new product that they haven't seen before and ask them to set it up for initial use. So with my camera, you can see what items came in the box, and there is a little bit of assembly that has to be done before the camera is ready to use. So I might have to charge the battery, I might have to insert it into the camera, etc. All of these are tasks that a user will have to do only once, perhaps, but they're critical. So if you're doing this, you're going to be testing, focusing on certain types of documentation, more likely than not. So things like quick reference guides, getting started guides, etc. And you'll be testing anything that has to be done before you can use the product. So for software websites, this might be registration. It might be installation. In some cases, there actually is nothing. Lots of public websites, they're kind of designed to be used immediately, and this step doesn't apply. Although I'm talking about these scenarios separately, you don't necessarily have to approach them separately. For some simpler products, you might be able to do them all in one session. But for something as complicated as this camera, there's so much functionality here that it would be extremely difficult for you to test it all at once. So one of the things that I did when I got this camera was look at some of these diagrams and try to figure out kind of how things fit together. Because I've owned this camera before, I actually knew a lot of it, but there was a little piece of plastic that I just didn't really understand the purpose of. And I tried to find it in the manual. And I actually couldn't. So I have this piece, and I don't know where it is now. It's lost. But that was something that was a gap in my knowledge that I was looking for in the manual. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I actually found that on the inside cover, there is these diagrams of everything that came with the camera, but I completely missed it because I had skipped past the table of contents. So that's an example of a usability problem that you might find in this type of testing.
Was the piece on that list?
Yes, it was it's a cover for the viewfinder. So when you're doing this type of unboxing or setup, the key question that you have in mind is, what do they need help with to get this thing set up? And it's usually, as Nancy also was mentioning, it's not something where somebody wants to read something cover to cover. They really need kind of in the moment help to do a specific task. In terms of how you want to structure the testing, it can really vary. You can do something that's relatively kind of freewheeling, where you just give somebody a general scenario of, let's say, getting the camera ready. Or it could be very specific. If you're trying to figure out whether they can install the battery, you give them the task of installing the battery, et cetera. And that will really depend on what you're trying to accomplish. So next up is this category of testing documentation for first use. And let's talk about that. So the way I would define first use is being able to accomplish really the core function that this software or this device was designed for. So what some of you just did or are doing right now is actually kind of a first use scenario. Many of you may not have seen a camera exactly like this before. You may not have seen the same brand. You may be familiar with DSLRs, in which case you have an advantage. So you might not need the manual. But for some of you, this might be something where you need extra help. So of those of you who have done it so far, was it difficult for anybody? Or maybe I should reverse. Was it really easy for somebody? OK. So basic and core functions. For this camera, obviously, taking a photo is a basic or core function. However, what you will see is that, OK, I can take a photo with a $100 camera or an iPhone, and that's a basic function. Or I can take a much better photo with this camera. Knowing how to take the better photo goes beyond just point and click. So that's where you would set the scenarios and make sure that, that you're covering the functionality in the test itself. So for this scenario, the key questions are, can they accomplish the core task? But also, can they identify the core features? So do they know how to set the aperture or the shutter speed? And some of you might not even know what that means, right? And that's a question for you to think about when you're choosing the users. So if you're testing a DSLR, do you want to just test it with anybody who hasn't used one before? Maybe for the unboxing, sometimes people get a camera for the first time. Once you get into some of the more complicated functionality, you want to start looking at users who have some background knowledge. So let me me talk a little bit about thinking aloud. Anybody not know what thinking aloud is? Well, everybody knows it already. So I'm actually going to talk about another approach, but obviously thinking aloud is the most common approach to usability testing. And it works really well if you have the time and resources to do it, and if the scope of your testing is relatively contained or focused. So something like unboxing or first use, it actually can work really well because the number of tasks or the number of features that you have to test isn't that great. So you can do it within the allotted time. And when you're testing the manual, obviously, it's going to be very difficult to test the whole manual in a single session. And you'll have to think about making compromises then to really test the core information. The third type of testing that I want to talk about, or testing scenario, is testing use for reference. And the way I'm defining this is really focusing on the more advanced functions and on tasks that are complex or more rare. So to give you an example of what I mean, I own a Roomba, which is an automatic vacuum cleaner. Sometimes you have to clean the filters, but I haven't done it yet. I have no idea how to do it. So when I have to do that, I'm going to have to go back to the manual. So that's a rare task. This camera probably has hardware and software. It probably has 100 different functions and adjustments in it. So imagine trying to test all of that. You really could spend days trying to test it with a single person. So it can get very complicated. So what do you do then? First of all, the key question that you're really going to ask yourself is not just can they use it, but can they really use it to its full capacity? And can the documentation support that? In some cases, this won't even apply. Like, for example, a public website. Sometimes everything has to be accessible and usable within your first access to the site. Something like enterprise software or devices, lots of times you do have the additional functionality. So an alternative method of usability testing is called a user edit. And the beginning I talked about the fact that you don't want to hand somebody a manual and just ask them to give you feedback. But what you can do is to give them the manual and give them whatever it is, or access to whatever it is this manual was written for, and to ask them to take it home, take it to the office, use it to accomplish whatever tasks they would be doing on a regular basis, and to give you feedback. So in this example, you're basically giving them instructions for how to give you feedback in terms of what's confusing, what's missing, etc. The advantage of this is obviously that you can get a lot more feedback from more people, and they're also using it in context. So with the camera scenario, with somebody in a room, you're going to get only so much feedback. You're not going to get, let's say, exposure to different light conditions. You won't get somebody trying to take pictures at a party. So with this, you really get the advantage of having the contextual feedback that you wouldn't normally have. So obviously, when you do that, at some point, you'll want to get at least the manual back. And the nice thing is that the findings will already be there. Your users will give you the findings that you just have to analyze. The last couple of things that I wanted to talk about is, and I've already alluded to this, is in some cases, it may be really important who you're testing with. In some cases, if you're testing something that's for a general audience, something that's publicly accessible, you'll want to focus on novices, people who haven't interacted with the product before. In other cases, if you get somebody who doesn't have the background information, and this is something for Nancy's manuals, obviously you wouldn't be able to test a really complicated manual with somebody who doesn't understand the subject matter. So be careful about what kind of background knowledge and biases your users are going to bring to the session. And to give you an example of my own use, the camera that's going around is an earlier version of this one. So when I got this camera, I approached it from the perspective of somebody who already knew how to use the previous version. So I was really noticing the differences and things that had changed. And in some cases, a change might actually be a usability problem for me, but not for users who are coming to it fresh. So my perspective is going to be very different. And when you're doing your testing, you really want to think about whether it makes sense to include people like me, or whether most of your audience are actually people who are, let's say, new to the product. And then a few pieces of final advice. If your company already does usability testing, your best bet for getting your documentation tested is to just have your documentation included as part of the test. If your company doesn't, you're going to have a really, really hard time getting somebody to do usability testing just for your manual. As user experience people, lots of times we actually struggle to get companies to do usability testing. So don't feel, if you're having a hard time, it's actually not atypical to do that. So you really want to work within an existing structure and work with people who are already doing testing. If you don't have that, I think the user edit is a great alternative, because you can do it informally and you don't really need a lot of resources internally to conduct that. And then finally, in terms of reporting and kind of getting your usability problems fixed, the kind of bad news is that there really is no single format. There is really no single guideline for the way that usability problems are reported. So it really depends on the company. Some companies might be okay with bulleted lists of findings. Some companies want formal reports. The good thing is that as technical writers, you obviously already have the background to report findings and recommendations clearly, so you're ahead of the game there. And I think I actually finished early, which I am shocked about. So let me open it up to questions, if anybody has one.
If anyone has questions, we have a mic.
Well, I have a question. I work in, I have a wide range of end users, from people who started working for electrical utilities right out of high school, right through people who have PhDs in engineering. And one of the difficulties I have is, first of all, I can't even get access to my end users because they're on substations and they're highly protected environments. But I can talk to people in a training, like National Grid has a training center. I can go there. But I'm talking to people who are not very verbal. You know, they're guys who drive around in trucks and like to climb up and down on generators and stuff like that. And I can't get that self-reporting function going. How do you coax stuff out of people who are clearly thinking, but they're not saying very much?
Yeah, so that's actually a big challenge because unfortunately the think aloud protocol obviously to some degree depends on people being able to verbalize their thoughts. In a case like this, sometimes sometimes you just can't get what you need. If somebody's not super eloquent and they just don't get it, or they're shy and not highly verbal, chances are you're not going to get them to really give you the information you're looking for. So I mean, in those cases, I would say rely more on observation and have them really kind of walk you through the process than rely on the self-report. But yeah, it's a challenge. It's one of those things that you obviously, as you do more moderating, you get better at, but there are definitely participants who are less verbal, and there's sometimes little you can do about it.
I just wanted to comment that I've got a Pentax SLR, looks like about the same model. Took me a year to figure out what that eyepiece was for. Could not find it in the instructions, so you're not alone.
That's good to know.
Just to follow up on that thought about observation, sometimes you can break through by asking them to teach you.
Thank you for both talks. I have a question for Nancy. Can you tell us some of your experiences in the technical communication field about usability? I mean, how often is usability done? When it's done, who is it done by, and some of your experiences?
Well, in my experience, in the 20 years of freelancing, I think I did usability maybe twice. And one time, I was working on a teleconferencing system. And the idea was that the admins were going to know all this gobbledygook about ISPs and this protocol and that SSN and that, all this technical jargon. It was just awful. And we had a high school intern. We wooed her with pizza. We asked her to come on her lunch break and work through the instructions. She gave us wonderful, wonderful feedback. Because even as tech writers, we consider ourselves the first advocate for the end user, and we get so up to our eyeballs in jargon, we forget that we start writing incomprehensibly. And the other day, I stood in a freezing garage at Doble as a young client support engineer, cabled up a new system and ran some tests. And we stood there freezing, and I scribbled madly, and he did talk his way through what he was doing. So in my experience, it's been people in the company. You get somebody who's just point in their development that they're about to learn how to use this product anyway, so you can piggyback onto that. Or you get somebody on their lunch break. My impression is that the old dinosaurs like Digital and Data General and started to have usability labs, then they died, and a lot of it died out. So it's very ad hoc, very informal has been my experience.
Yeah, just to add a very small point. There's probably 20 different flavors of usability. 20 is an exaggeration, but there's various flavors of usability testing that you can do, from online, remote, in person, moderated, unmoderated. So there is usually, where there is a will, there is a way. But if your company doesn't really buy into it, it can be very difficult. And this is something that we face in the UX world all the time.
And as a follow-up to that, I'd say one of the things, if you have participants or people you need to talk to who really aren't responsive. That just happens. One thing that we do quite a lot where I work now is we ask people, like, what are the top 2 things that are your biggest frustration, your pain points? You do that with 5, 10 people, there's common themes that usually come through. The other thing is that we've actually come really big with doing user interviews and just talking to people and having a conversation. And it's usually a way to try to get general information, but after you talk to people, usually 5, 6, 7 people, in about a certain topic, and of course it goes off topic a little bit, and you have to know how to facilitate that. You do get common themes and common issues, like if there was something with this camera that just didn't work, eventually there would be some things that would come up. You could kind of have a list of what would it be, and even in any situation that happened, interviews tend to also make people feel a little more comfortable if you realize once you talk to a person, they kind of forget a lot of things, like they might be being recorded or things like that. But even if you do that, it's a very kind of a good way to get information in a way that people tend to feel a lot more comfortable, where usability testing sometimes can also be a little more stifling and it's a little sterile. Oh, my name is LaRoche. Hi, by the way. I'm the 3rd person here to talk. What I want to talk about is Nancy nicely asked me to talk here today is because I was a tech writer for many, many years. I was, 12 years, and then I've been a usability person or UX person, which is a term we in the field tend to use interchangeably, which is not really great, but we use all these terms interchangeably. So if I say UX and usability, it really means the same thing. I've been doing that about 8 years. In one of my jobs, I was actually the bridge between the UX group and the tech writing group. So what I'm going to talk about is just some of the common themes, things that I've experienced in both, and the overlaps that I say, that I've seen in the field. One of the things I actually was laughing at when Nancy started talking tonight is, today actually when I came into the office, they actually asked me to look at a review one of these. It was a customer satisfaction survey, and they wanted me to look at the UI. And so I spent about half the day doing it, but I realized half of that work I was doing was rewriting some of the content because it was so obtuse. And I didn't even think about that because so much of what I do is writing. I mean, part of me is I am a tech writer by trade. You'll see by my slides, I'm still very text dense. I'm not very good with visuals. So, but at the same point, I realized a lot of the work that I do as a UX person is still very much based in helping with content, writing content. So in a way, it's a good foundation, but so much of what I think's helped me be successful as a UX person has been having all that background and understanding, not only the tech writing background, but just understanding the technology and what, because as a tech writer and a UX person, we do care about the end user. That's what our main goal is. We're a little bit luckier in UX to be able to actually have more of a connection to people, because sometimes we can get connections to our users and have access to them a lot more. But before I go completely off track, I just want to talk a little bit about my background and also how this lecture evolved. I've been talking about this for a long time, and as some of my former colleagues are here tonight know, I talked about it all the time when I work with them. But one of the things is I've actually had this really interesting thing, because I've seen just so many changes have happened in both fields the last 10 years, and I found it just fascinating, because in a way I felt like I was living through history, just seeing all the changes that were happening in tech writing, how usability and UX was really kind of taking off and coming out on its own. And but at the same time, I felt it was really weird, because there was so many overlapping things that I thought, there's so many things that we do in common, but we actually quite often, until recently, don't really talk to each other that much. There isn't we're in different departments, which is changing. But I think the one thing I tell is, I also teach this at night. I taught, some of you might remember from a long time ago, there was a program at Northeastern called the Masters of Technical Writing, and it kind of went away, but it came back. But we have it now, and it's in a very different mode. And I've been teaching there, and I used to teach tech writing, and I teach UX now. But it's very interesting because so much of the overlap of what we do is the same. And I used to teach an information architecture class, which is a high fancy term in UX, and it's about organizing information. And I remember the first thing I tell all my students is, as a technical writer, you've been doing information architecture your entire career. You've been organizing information, putting it together, finding that out, but somehow they kind of put this fancy label on it in UX, and it seems different. But it's really all about organizing information and content. So today, what I really just want to do is talk about the connection between the field, how I see a lot of collaboration has been happening, and it's actually increasing even more. Changes in the tech comm profession, the rise of content strategy, which is something that was kind of this amorphous marketing thing that kind of was important a few years ago, but it's really made a lot of inroads into both fields of late, and just kind of how this is going to influence both of our works. So one of the things, I assume everyone knows what user-centered design is. Does anyone? Doesn't? Okay. Well, one of the things that I found as I kind of moved from my technical writing career into a full-time UX is that it was strange is because so often, even in the best of intentions, tech writers tended to be involved more towards the end of the cycle. To be honest with you, UX people usually were too because they were doing usability testing when it first came out. That's changing as UX is getting more involved earlier in the process. But one of the things I really wanted to do is I really wanted to be involved earlier when I could hopefully help make decisions about doing the UI, writing up things that are, make sure that the UI is consistent, the terminology is consistent, and that there's a unique place with a lot of UX people could get involved in that earlier. And so it's really nice to be involved, and one of the things that has really expanded within UX that a lot of we call ourselves user researchers sometimes, and what that is a lot of things that tech writers do is you kind of learn, we do surveys, we talk about the interviews I was talking about earlier, doing these various things, organizing information through card sorts, which a lot of tech writers do. We do that all the time, but getting involved earlier in the process is just so much more beneficial, and sometimes there is less documentation, but also it is actually much easier to write documentation when you have a UI, as we all know, that isn't completely convoluted. You're not having to do workarounds all the time. Also, has anyone ever had the opportunity when you have observed a usability test to actually incorporate any of that feedback into your documentation or change anything? Yeah, see, and that's the thing that's really, actually I'm gonna see if I'm able to get away. That's one of the things that I really like. One of the things that I find really interesting is that in my mind, this is kind of the geek in me, I always find that UX is much more, oh, should I stay in one place so I'm not, okay. The UX structure and organization is very much where I thought tech comm was. Like, it's pretty straightforward now. Most tech writers or tech comm departments are pretty much either in a central tech comm department, under marketing, under QA, where UX is all over the place. We're still very, very immature in that way. We're sometimes our own group, we're sometimes in development, we're sometimes in marketing, we're sometimes just on our own. And I think one of the things is that tech comm is much more settled in that way, and they're also a sign of maturity. If you actually tell somebody who knows nothing about technology what you do, you say tech writer, people kind of understand what you do. You say that and say, oh, I'm a UX person or a usability person. It's like, what? And if they don't have any understanding of technology, it's very difficult. It's not really kind of synced down. Like I try to talk to my parents all the time and say, what do you do? I'm like, I'm in a field that didn't exist when I graduated college. And so they're like, no, okay, so we don't even talk about it. So one of the things that I've talked about, and I know this is kind of a bit wordy, but I've seen over the last decade a real, it's called a consolidation, or there's really the common communication functions. I think this was something that was happening after the dot-com bubble, but then I think after the 2008 thing, it really happened a lot more. But really what a lot of companies are doing is they're putting technical writing, user experience, the training organization, all of them as one organization in one group because they see it all as a communication function. Part of this was due to cost savings, there's no doubt. But I think there's actually a lot of benefits to that too, usually, and because it is one way in some of the more progressive companies to actually, for people to work together closer, because even in the best of intentions, if you're in a tech writing group or you're a solo writer somewhere down in working for a particular development project, and there's UX people over there, even if the best intentions, you don't necessarily talk as much. But I do think having more of these common communication functions together is actually beneficial to both groups. Again, the main thing is we want to have a usable interface. You also want to be able to have the workflow that makes sense to the user. That's both better for the user and it's good for writers because it's easier documentation to write and it's less complicated. It's also better because it's more usable if people have less of a burden. Again, as we all know, the better the product's designed at the beginning, the less documentation it is, the better it is for everybody all around. I would say that, I just have a question. Does anybody here, have you worked in a company where they've merged together the UX and the technical communication departments? It actually started to happen. I saw it about 7, 8 years ago in some of the more progressive companies. It's happened a lot, I'd say the last 2 or 3 years. And my guess is it's going to happen more and more in even the more traditional development or engineering-driven companies for a lot of reasons. I also see a lot of people who were technical writers, technical communicators, their title is being changed, and this is part of the marketing part of it is just like you're a usability engineer now, or you're going to be a usability communicator or something like that. The terms are changing, and again, this is more in the more progressive kind of maybe consumer-focused companies that are more consumer software products, not as much in the engineering-driven companies. But I still think it's something that's very much happening. So here's the thing. I think technical communication actually can offer a lot to the usability teams that they don't necessarily, or the UX people they don't actually have. One of the things is sorry, excuse me, is the technical expertise and the part of the technical communication team is usually much more so than the UX person. And this is a vast stereotype, but UX people generally are nowhere near as technically have as much technical acumen as tech comm people. That's just because they're usually involved in different ways in the process, where most tech writers, depending on what company they work in, have to have a lot of technical experience. And as one who didn't have any technical experience, I kind of learned it for a long way. It's been funny for my journey because I used to be highly technical, and the more UX I do, the less technical I get, and I just kind of can't even do some basic things anymore that I'm actually surprised at. But one of the things that I'm actually really find is a lot of the usability teams can actually help tech writers with, you always talk about audience analysis, but a lot of the things that we do as UX people is talking about the user interviews, really kind of trying to get connections to and getting tech writers in contact with people through surveys or through user interviews. Getting feedback from the products. A lot of times we can kind of help as UX people to help analyze the data if you do have access to surveys. And a lot of times marketing departments, if you can talk to them, is increasing reliance on talking to them. The UX people can kind of help the tech writer kind of go through that data and analyze it in a way that you can actually come out with common things that might not be readily apparent. But if you do certain types of coding and analysis and just chopping the data up, it's actually very interesting to find much different ways in which some of that data might be really useful in just how you will and will not complete the documentation. There's a bunch of things. There's been a lot of changes, as we all know, in the technical communication profession in the last 10 years. There's a lot of reasons for this. And what I just have here is, here's the thing, and I think most everyone will probably, some of these will look very familiar. Development cycles have been compressed with the growth of Agile, whatever we define that to be. That certainly made things much quicker. There's been, I use this term and I just think it sounds cute, so I used it. But I mean, a lot of technical communication has been commodified. It's more of a commodity, at least certain aspects of technical communication are. There's been outsourcing, both domestic and abroad. A lot of times there's been resource reallocation for technical communications, and that means sometimes they've cut them, sometimes they've moved people into UX positions, or they've transferred various jobs into the UX department. There's more and more demands for higher satisfaction. One of the things that I always felt very frustrated by as a writer was I was set up in a situation where I couldn't talk to users, I had to write for the users, I had an unreasonable time frame, and then when the documentation didn't come out the way that a user wanted to use it, because I never got to talk to a user, they blamed me. And I was really irritated about that. So one of the things, another huge thing is reducing the amount of content delivered. This is for a lot of reasons. Companies, I mean, nobody prints anymore. Companies don't want to have too much content. They figure the more content they have, the more writers they need. But they also, translation costs. A lot of companies don't want to deal with translation. So they're doing much, this is both a cost issue. This is also an issue to deal with. They don't want the translation issues. They also want to have more of the software. More of the software has to be intuitive, discoverable, learnable, things like that. And they don't want to rely, at least a lot of the companies don't want to rely on just put it in the doc, because that's not acceptable for a lot of customer documents anymore. There's also been a huge increase in awareness and buy-in of UX and also the term content strategy of recent. Some of it's really good. Some of it's, I think, in some ways, the UX world, for all their immaturity, has been very good at like selling themselves. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's a very good. They understand how to like talk to the business people sometimes pretty well. Here are some practical examples of usability, such as I've done. What Eva talked about in the installation guide, the user edit is a great way to just kind of go through and see how people use documentation. In user edit, especially in task-based stuff like installation guides, is great. Surveys are really good. Doing a good survey is really difficult to write up so that you're not leading, but getting surveys is a great way to get a lot of information cheap. It's also a good way to get a huge bundle of information from a wide variety of customers. They are self-selecting, but it still is a very good way versus a user interview, which is more time-intensive, or a usability test. The interview is also another thing that I strongly advocate for, because it's a way to connect people with the product and understand what their issues are. It's also a way to get a lot of really valuable information fairly inexpensively, not as inexpensively as survey, but close. Content strategy, has people heard that term? Anybody have an idea what it means? That's because there's no one definition. They're even worse than UX people at defining it. So I'm going to take a stab at it, though, because I'm a martyr. So here we go. So there's been the buzzword. It was out there about 4 or 5 years ago. It started content strategy, content strategy, content strategy. It's really important. What it really started was there was a lot of people in marketing, in as much as both UX and tech com people don't really have a lot of time for marketing. There was a lecture a couple years ago. The guy put it down. He's like, y'all make fun of marketing. Nobody likes marketing. Their budget's usually double or triple what engineering is. Make marketing your friends. Make them like you like them, you'll get money. Something I never forgot about that. That being said, content strategy started with taking a lot of the marketing, the public relations document, and companies were like, and think about a big company like Adobe or Microsoft, they have all this documentation, all the stuff that's being out there, whether it be the marketing department, whether it be customer support documentation, whether it be everything but the traditional technical communication. They're spending a lot of money on it. They're sending stuff out that's contradictory to each other. They're not actually representing the brand because you have different groups sending out different things. So a lot of companies have said, whoa, we need to actually have a better brand strategy for ourselves, which delves into the marketing area, but they also, it's too much money. It's costing us too much. So what content strategy has been trying to do is to kind of have an idea of having a centralized group, or if not a centralized group, at least a streamlined, consistent way in which our documentation of everything, and this is content in the full form of marketing, PR, customer support, and I'd say only of late, technical communication, which is technical communication is the one that's been the last holdup because it tends to be much more complicated and much more voluminous. But I think that's I've seen that happen in a few companies now where companies want to try to get a handle on all the content they own. Because content really is one of the things that's worth a lot of money to a lot of really important companies. That's my stab at it. I think it's going to happen more and more in technical communication. They're going to kind of be tied into a centralized type. It goes back to that common communication function. Companies are centralizing this stuff, and they want to try to get a handle on it. That's all very high pie in the sky. The one thing I would suggest is everybody go out and buy the book by Ginny Reddish, Letting Go of Words. She was a technical writer for many years. She's been a UX guru for many, many years. This book's a few years old now, but it really is more about just writing clear, consistent content from a technical writer's perspective, and just kind of thinking that the web and online content is now the new medium, it's the new standard. So you just have to really kind of basically be a ferocious editor of yourself. But she also kind of starts, and she's done a lot of work with content strategy and trying to rein it in and define it in a way that's understandable. Okay. Now that I've said all that, how's this going to influence our work? So taken to the extreme, a totally usable product wouldn't need documentation. Realistically, that's never going to happen, particularly with larger, very complex products. The software, the UI needs to be more intuitive as it is becoming. There's still a tremendous need for a lot of content. Particularly, I was even thinking like reference material. How many times have we had, reference tables. You just have to fill in all that information because people need to know when you have 300 or 400 just different things in a table. You need to have all of that just registered in the parameters of that. I do think this is a really great opportunity for a lot of UX people to or for a lot of tech com people to understand the basics of UX and just some of the basic stuff. I mean, for me, I was a writer starting in '95, and I officially was a writer until about 2006. But I started doing UX stuff. I started testing documentation that I had written, which is like the worst thing you're supposed to do as a UX person. You're never supposed to test the own stuff you do on your own, but nobody else was doing it, and I was interested in it. But I just started testing documentation, and I realized actually I was coming in here tonight, my last 2 jobs as a writer, part of the reason I got the jobs, I think, was because I actually had an interest in this usability thing, and they're like, oh, you know about this, and I really didn't know much about it. I wasn't interested in it, but I was like, I'd like to do some testing of that, and that was a differentiator, and they were like, oh, they like that. So I also got lucky. So here's where I think this is going to really influence particularly technical communicators. The idea that technical communication skills, it's kind of expected. You have to have solid writing skills. You have to have a technology inquisitiveness and critical thinking. And the thing, like for me, I remember one of my first interviews as an intern, this woman's like, I don't know if you can write. I don't really care. I can teach you how to write. You need to be really inquisitive and ask the right questions. I can teach anybody how to write, but if you are not going to ask the questions, you're not interested in technology. But that really stuck with me. I mean, I think understanding some basics of UX and content strategy is really becoming more important because I think there's so much more of an overlay and an overlap of both the fields. I do think documentation will always exist. I think it's going to be radically different, and I think we're in a time where we don't know. I mean, I have ideas based on what I've seen, but I can't make any prediction of what's going to be in 10 years because it just changes so radically. But I do know that companies want to spend less on voluminous documentation. They do want to have stuff that's, especially for the Gen Y, they want stuff in more video format, streamlined, and that doesn't mean to make it simple or make it dumb, but it needs to be in a way that's digestible for people. Which I think, again, it goes back to the situation we as tech writers were set up in is like, write this manual, it's 400 pages, you can't have access to users, we're not going to give the software until the week before release. And I think some of that is changing because they're getting, I think in certain companies, writers are getting involved earlier because they realize the writer has to have a say in it earlier. I think the idea of just doing more in the amount of words is not really an option for a lot of reasons. Increased demand of user satisfaction, but also the more you write, the more translation costs happen. And any major software company is thinking about that because they have no choice but to translate anymore. It's not like, get it out there and we'll think about we translate if we have sales in XYZ country. That's not really realistic anymore. There has been an explosive field in the growth of UX the last decade. To be perfectly honest with you, when I started this field, I kind of thought, I'd be okay. I think the field's going to be growing. And then it just exploded. I mean, I don't think even all of the most vocal proponents of UX ever thought it was going to explode and be used as much as it is now. When I saw TV ads for Cadillac talking about the customer experience, I was like, okay, maybe it's jumped the shark at this point. But yeah, when they're talking about stuff like that on TV ads, we've arrived. Think about the level of information. Think about the level of information that's been available since 1970, 1980, since the advent of the web. And even now, it's like, I think it's like every 6 months, the amount of information available is doubling and tripling. So, and that's not going to really change in the near term. It's going to continue at least most of our working lifetimes. I do think technical communicators have usually been striving for usability and usable documentation for a very long time. I think it's been a very difficult change as we've kind of went from the book format to the online format. And I heard a speaker that actually put it in perspective for me about a month ago. She was saying, we were using the book format for 1,500 years. We've actually only had this online version of a book for basically 20. She was like, it's going to take 2 or 3 generations before we actually get this right. So don't beat yourself up about it because this is over a millennium they've been doing it this way. So we're going to have some fits and starts and we're getting used to this online thing. I do really think having some usability experience, whether it be observing testing, whether it be inquiring about it, whether it be looking into books like Ginny Reddish's book, I think that's a great introduction just to be able to talk the talk and just say, this is very important and this is part of the overall toolkit that's going to be helpful for us as writers, but also as helping really talking about the user experience and the customer experience, because it's really what many companies want to hear, even if they don't fully understand it. And one of the things that I've actually found very interesting is that with the growth of the UX, is a lot of management types up there are saying, oh, this UX thing, this usability, we need it, we need it, we need it. They have no idea what it is, but they know they talk to their other manager friends and like, we need to get this because they have that. And so if you have people on the ground who understand it, whether it be writers, marketing people, UX people on the ground, having the bottom up push and then having the top, maybe if they don't fully understand it, but they know it's important, that's a really good meeting ground to actually have, because eventually you will have a really good solid base of that in the middle of the company doing the work. But it really is, the buy-in from management is huge. This is another thing that actually I find a particular interest in, and I think it's going to radically change just content, how we perceive it, how we deliver it, things like that. It's all about the demographics. So the baby boomers are, and these are all rough guesstimates, baby boomers are roughly my age, 48 to 50 to about 65. Gen X, which I like to think I'm Gen X because I feel a little younger, it's like 33 to 49 roughly. And then the Gen Y millennials, which are the 18 to 32-year-olds, which is all the press about. Everybody makes fun of now. They don't want to work. They want to work from 12 to 8, whatever. The interesting thing that's really happening is this is a huge, huge thing in how it's going to affect technology. Because you think about it, baby boomers came of an age when the baby boomer goes online to do things. People like me, the Gen X, we kind of just hope it's there, but we don't necessarily make that differentiation. The Gen Y millennials, they grew up with the internet. They didn't know anything when it didn't exist. They expect Wi-Fi. They expect everything online. They expect everything to be succinct, to be chunked, to be well-designed. They won't put up with stuff that's not well-designed, which, when you're working in a software that you have no choice but to use, that's one thing. But this whole cultural change is happening where just bad software is no longer acceptable in a lot of different areas. And I think right now it's really interesting because most of the people who are the workers and the product managers are generally the Gen X and baby boomers. Gen X will pretty much take over in the next couple of years. But wait about 10 years when the Gen Ys take over. What we do, how we work, and how products are designed and developed is probably going to change pretty radically because they don't have the baggage that people like me did when I was happy to work on a VAX VMS system, didn't understand it, spent lots of time on CLI command lines. That's not acceptable. They might think it's cute to go and have fun with it, but it's not a basis of doing lots of work. So I just think one of the things that I find fascinating is that out of all these groups, the Gen X, which is what I'd like to consider myself part of, is actually the smallest group of those three. And that's just partly is the Gen X is really kind of taking over lower mid and then eventually taking over management. They kind of are in control of the design and a lot of the engineering teams and stuff like that now. Gen Y is much bigger. Gen Y will be taking over. Gen Y's changes is going to be really interesting. And so I'm both very excited about it and happy I'll be retiring in about 12 or 15 years. So here's just some of my reflections on it. Things have become much more usable the last decade or so. I mean, how many times, I know in my career, I documented lots of basic Windows commands or how to do stuff in a browser. That's quite rare today because there's an assumption and level of knowledge that has gone up tremendously, which is good. There's an expectation that products and services have to be more useful. They can't not be unusable, and that includes documentation. And I think that's probably a good thing, but it's going to demand more streamlined documentation, more interesting ways in how documentation and content in general is delivered. The Nest thermostat is one example that I find fascinating, and it's a little bit of the kind of yuppie overload of Apple lately, but really to have the idea of like, think about, and this is where a lot of the things I think are going to be happening with really good UX design over the next year, is all these products we have in the house that we never really thought of that were kind of clunky. Smoke detectors. The thermostat is most thing. Everybody has a thermostat in their house. Most of us don't know how it works. We know it was programmable. We never could figure it out. It was really complicated. But Nest took this kind of really interesting way, and people who have smartphones, you can change it. You can change the temperature. You can actually go in and change it on your own. It's very easy. It's like the old style ones that we grew up with where you turn it, it goes up, it goes back, and it uses that metaphor, which is really smart. It's really expensive, but people will still pay for it. So I think that's one example of how things are changing, and just look at so many more of your house products, and I can just imagine now thinking about refrigerators and just even more stuff with the TV that's going to happen over the next few years. And one of the things that I said, I mean, how many times when I was a writer, I'd say, oh, just do that just in case, just in case. And that era is over. I mean, there's no more, oh, just put that in, just put it in. That might happen in some companies, but that's a dying thing because it's too expensive to do that. I think just enough documentation is now exactly where so much of the industry is going. And that's probably a good thing. I do think the growth of UX and usability has really increased a lot. It's only going to increase more. It might have more permutations, and knowing our group, we'll probably have more terms to use that are completely interchangeable, but they sound fun, so we'll use them anyways. There are many historical and practical connections between the two fields. I know at one point when I went back to, I got a degree in UX, and when I did that, actually, it was funny because at that time there was, I think, about a quarter to a third of the people in the program were technical writers. I think that's probably changed a little bit just because there's been so many more people coming in. But in some ways, I think it's a really natural progression for people to kind of do technical writing and then kind of move into the UX or usability sphere, because it is, I mean, they're almost like first cousins in a way, because they're so related in what we both have the main interest in. And I do think just knowing the basics of UX will really help with the job differentiator, or just helping yourself in the company just to kind of move around or expand or anything like that, just because it is a field that's only going to continue to grow over the next few years. And that's it. Oops. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to chat, or we have Nancy and Eva as well.
Cool. And I've got a mic. Questions?
Hi.
Hi, Bill.
BostonCHI. This isn't really a question. It's a backing up of something you said. You were talking about how you wanted to get involved earlier. And my aha moment came about 25 years ago when I was wearing 3 hats at the same time that all started with the letter D. I was designing an interface, I was developing it, and I was documenting it. And because I was the same person, I was able to communicate with myself a lot better than different departments, but I still thought of it the traditional way. So I didn't think about the documentation until the development was done. And then I sat down and said, now I have to document what I did. And as I was documenting it, I was thinking, this is hard to document. If it were easier to document, it would be easier to use. And so I went in and changed the design and and did the development so that the documentation would make sense. And I think, you know, having documentation input into the design of the product, you can't, like you were saying, you know, the big thick manual is going away. The more things you have that are easy to explain, the better the product is.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I would say, kind of following on to that, that's been really interesting in the UX community, is that I came of age when, I mean, I'm all about evaluation methods and research. That's what I like. And the field's moving more and more towards design. And it's funny because I obviously, from my slides, I don't have the design eye. I'm a crappy designer. But at the same point, like the field of UX really was all about usability testing, user research. But it's really morphed the last few years where it's gone into design as a huge component of it now. And that's going to be the most important component within a few years. But it ties back totally to that thing. Now that there is, in UX, there's design, evaluation, research, it makes it much, I think, much more sympathetic to understanding the plight of having to document something. And there's much more forcing of making sure the design is done well from the beginning, so the documentation that's done isn't repetitive. It's actually useful and helpful as a supplement, not as saying, here's this workaround, here's this workaround.
So I just want to have an example of a UX and documentation working together, because I'm a technical writer for product, and we also have a UX team. We're all part of the development department. And obviously they're doing the UX designs, and I'm reviewing all that. And how we interact is, you know, they do their designs, I review everything, review all the text that's on the screen, just to make sure all the terminology is correct, because I know the product a little better. And we also work with them to designs like how to probably in the future present some context-sensitive. I'll probably want to do that in the context of our application. So, you know, I'm in there from the beginning, and you know, we interact very well.
I mean, the thing about, not only is that better for the user, it's also, it's better for the product too. Just having that kind of connection, it's just going to make the product better. We've all known for a long time, but management hasn't actually figured that out till recently.
One resource that helps with usability testing that we haven't quite mentioned yet is customer support. For purely, we didn't have enough people reasons. At one point, I was the chief customer support person and also the documentation person for a product. And I could ask myself practically every day, what is it that people have trouble with? And that sort of information could feed very well both back into design and into that we had to explain in the documentation. It was tremendously valuable.
And I would say, actually, where I work now in my day job, we're actually in the customer support department, and that was no accident. They put us there on purpose because we have a lot more connections to users. But the other thing that I actually find fascinating about that is we have all the data. We can get the data on what people did. And we can be in a usability test and say, oh, I do this. And the amount of tests I've facilitated where it's people have not been able to get anything, and the software's awful, and they're like, how was that? Oh, that was easy. But with this, with the customer support, you're getting the data on what really the issues are. And so it's a really great way. If you say you don't have access to users, customer support and the data there is usually the best way to get information because you can get it. There's tons of it, and it's really what people are having issues with.
Okay, last call. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone.